Imagine a house of worship 30 meters tall, its inner chambers sheathed with nearly 27 tons of hammered gold, and massive bronze columns 8 meters high standing guard at the entrance. Picture single blocks of stone, shaped and fitted so precisely they seem hewn for eternity, some of them weighing as much as 400 tons. Now ask, how was any of this accomplished 3,000 years ago without modern cranes, explosives, or power tools, and under a rule that forbade the sound of iron tools on the sacred site itself? Those are not modern exaggerations, but the headline facts that the biblical account gives us. The books of 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles describe a building project on a scale that challenges our imagination. Enormous quantities of timber and metals, thousands of laborers, and techniques that combined local know-how with foreign craftsmanship. This is the story of Solomon's temple as both a sacred achievement and an engineering puzzle, how human skill, political alliances, and religious discipline combine to deliver something that still arrests us now. See 1 Kings 5-7, 1 Kings 8:10-11 for the dedication. If this account reaches you, stay with it. There is a deeper picture beyond the numbers, and the practical secrets behind those numbers will surprise you. Before we go further, please subscribe if you want more detailed explorations of ancient constructions and the lives behind them. The first layer of the mystery lies at the quarry. How do you take solid bedrock and produce blocks large enough to form the core of a monumental temple? The answer is not mystery, but method. Careful, patient, and brutal work, guided by craftsmen who understood rock as a material that can be persuaded, not merely struck. Quarries were chosen for rock of reliable quality and proximity to the building site. Stones destined for the temple were not rough lumps dragged from the bed and finished in Jerusalem. They were prepared at the quarry, almost as if the builders outsourced the problem of fitting to the source. Craftsmen would trace the outline of the block on the bedrock, marks that functioned like a modern cutting list, and then they would begin to separate it from the living rock. The ancient technique that scholars reconstruct is deceptively simple. The drilling of a line of holes or shallow cuts along the intended separation plane, the insertion of wedges, often wooden, and the use of water to expand those wedges. Dry wood inserted into narrow cuts will swell when wetted. As it expands, it exerts uniform pressure across the cut and gradually forces the stone to split along that plane. In places where the shape demanded greater finesse, workers used paired wooden wedges and then alternated hammering and soaking until the block released. This allowed surprisingly precise separations without relying on brittle percussion that would shatter the stone. These wedges and water methods left the blocks relatively complete at the quarry, so complete that many were marked there with symbols and letters indicating their final place in the building. Imagine a series of stonemasons, each responsible for specific panels or blocks, marking them with signs so that when a massive piece arrived in Jerusalem, the masons would know exactly where to set it. Those marks, attested in other ancient monuments and sometimes visible in archaeological contexts, turned the problem of how to cut into a solved logistical step. Cut at the source, fit at the destination. This approach had practical benefits beyond precision. Removing most of the finishing work from the congested site of Jerusalem reduced noise, dust, and the risk of contaminating sacred precincts. It also meant that when the blocks arrived, they were essentially ready to be assembled, an advantage when the project carried both religious timetable and royal prestige. But getting a stone out of its bed and partially dressed is only half the battle. The next question is transport. How to move enormous weights from quarry to palace, often across rugged country and sometimes across water. The methods were ingenious combinations of brute force, mechanical advantage, and choreography. For overland movements, builders relied on ramps and rollers. Earthwork ramps, earthen embankments, often lubricated with clay or water, could create a gentle, continuous incline up which a sled or sledge bearing a block could be hauled. The sled would rest on greased planks or logs, and teams of men would pull with ropes made from vegetable fibers such as flax or date palm, braided into cords strong enough to bear incredible strain. When the terrain was favorable, round logs placed under the sledge acted as rollers. As the block advanced, logs from the rear were brought forward and reused, a simple but effective conveyor. To grasp the scale, consider that a 400-ton block is roughly equivalent to the weight of 60 adult elephants. Moving such a load required not only raw manpower, but tight organization. Men working in coordinated teams, rhythms set by overseers or a lead caller, and multiple lines of pull so forces could be spread and managed. Archaeological analogies from monumental projects in Egypt and Mesopotamia help us picture these operations. Anchors of men and drilled timbers, staggered pulls, and controlled incremental progress measured in meters over days or weeks. When the route included water, the builders exploited the sea. Mediterranean maritime networks had already linked Lebanon, Phoenicia, and the coastal cities to the inland capitals for centuries. Timber, particularly cedar from the Lebanon, was floated on rafts or lashed onto barges and ships at the port of Tyre or other harbors, then shipped to Jaffa or other coastal points and hauled inland. The cedar log was a critical strategic resource. It was prized for its resistance to rot, its straight grain, and its fragrance. In the biblical record, Solomon negotiated with the king of Tyre, commonly known to scholars as Hiram, to secure cedar and skilled workers, 1 Kings 5. Hiram supplied not only wood, but also descendants of the Phoenician tradition in carpentry and metalworking. Transport was perilous and sometimes lethal. Ropes would fray and snap with catastrophic force. Men hauling along narrow paths or on steep ramps could be killed by falling timbers or collapsing sledges. Shipments might founder in storms. The biblical account does not whitewash these risks, and when we read of the scale of labor, tens of thousands employed in different capacities, it is essential to remember the human cost behind the statistics. The project's logistics required not only skill, but a supply chain of constant labor and a political framework willing to mobilize it. Which brings us to resources beyond stone and manpower, the cedars and the metals. The Lebanon cedars were prized, and procuring them required a diplomatic arrangement. Tyre, a maritime trading power on the Levantine coast, had access to both cedar forests and seafaring vessels. Solomon's agreements with Tyre, described in 1 Kings 5, gave him access to shipments of cedar and craftsmen in exchange for foodstuffs and payments. The cedar was cut by specialized woodcutters, teams familiar with forest techniques and with the danger of felling such massive trunks. Once felled, large logs were trimmed and made ready for transport. In many cases, they were lashed into rafts or loaded on ships for coastal movement. Moving cedar by sea was not a simple cart and wagon operation. The craftspeople of Tyre and adjacent ports built primitive platforms and rafts that could hold multiple logs and distribute weight for safer passage. Once ashore, the timber faced an overland leg hauled by teams of oxen and men and sometimes stored and seasoned before being worked. The demand for cedar extended to both structural timbers and to interior paneling that would later receive gold overlay. The combination of cedar's strength and the pliability of its grain made it an ideal material for both the visible and hidden parts of the temple's fabric. Metallurgy was the other pillar of the temple's opulence. Bronze and gold define the visual character described in the accounts. Massive bronze work, including 2 pillars commonly called Jachin and Boaz, and a host of vessels and fittings overlaid with gold. The biblical text names a master craftsman, Huram or Hiram the artisan, who came from Tyre with a pedigree of metalworkers and artisans. See 1 Kings 7:13-14, 2 Chronicles 2:13-14. He and his team handled alloying, casting, and the finishing work that transformed raw metal into ritual instruments and decor. The bronze work required large furnaces and skilled control of temperatures. Casting the huge alluvial forms, pillars, lavers, basins, may have been achieved through piece molding and joining rather than single monolithic castings in many cases, but the finish and decorative motifs demanded flare-welded joins, hammered surfaces, and inlays. Gold overlay or hammering, known as embossing or leafing, was an art in itself. Gold leaf, hammered to a hair's breadth, would be applied to cedar paneling and to bronze surfaces to give the interior that legendary glint. Heating, annealing, and repeated hammering softened and stretched the gold. Artisans worked in hot, smoky workshops where sparks and scolding were part of the trade. The presence of Phoenician artisans like Huram is crucial to the story because Israelite tradition and Solomon's political strategy leveraged foreign expertise. The kings of Tyre had long been masters of maritime timber and metallic craft, and their craftsmen brought techniques and traditions that were not endemic in Israel. This international collaboration is part of what made the temple unique, a fusion of local religious intent with external skills and materials flowing across political lines. Underpinning all these materials and techniques was an organizational system massive in scale. The biblical record supplies dramatic figures: 150,000 workers in rotated teams, 80,000 stonecutters, 70,000 burden bearers, 10,000 woodcutters in Lebanon, a command structure with 3,300 supervisors and 550 chief officers. Whether we take these numbers as literal head counts or as representative orders of magnitude, they convey a clear fact. The temple was a state-level enterprise requiring logistics, provision, payroll, discipline, and a chain of command. Rotational labor is especially important for understanding how the supply of labor sustained an extended project. Rather than tie up the entire population, the system seems arranged in cohorts. Israelite labor could be organized in service periods, months, or seasons so that agricultural cycles were not completely interrupted. Conscripted labor from Canaanite populations likely supplied a steady, continuous workforce for the most demanding tasks. Supervisors and chief officers maintain discipline and coordinate the interface between quarry, sea, caravan, workshop, and the laded site. Discipline could be severe. The speed implied by the project, completed according to the text within 7 years for the core building, 1 Kings 6:38, suggests strict enforcement of schedules. Accidents, injuries, and fatalities occurred as they do in any large-scale primitive construction. The human cost was real: men crushed by stones, drowned on rafts, or dying under harsh conditions in forest camps or smelting sites. The biblical record does not celebrate this toll. It records the achievement while letting the reader infer the price. The religious rules that governed the project created their own technical obstacles. One extraordinary injunction recorded in the text states that no iron tool was to be heard in the temple while it was being built, no hammer, chisel, or iron instrument to mar the sanctity of the work, see 1 Kings 6:7. This prohibition raises two immediate technical problems: how to shape stone without metal tools, and how to manage finishing and joining in a way that preserves the sanctity demanded by the project. The solution, again, is a combination of quarry-side finishing and careful choice of methods. The initial cutting used wedges, hammering of wooden implements, and abrasion. Where metal tools were necessary for certain tasks, the finishing often occurred off-site or employed non-ferrous tools wherever possible. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was available and used for many fittings, so metalworking itself did not violate the rule. The prohibition of iron, the symbol of the common and martial tool, served a theological function: to keep the sanctuary free from the instruments associated with war and bloodshed. At the same time, it forced innovation: more reliance on ready-made blocks, more work in the quarries, and meticulous pre-planning so that the sacred precinct avoided the soundscape of iron. All these pieces come together in the final months of the operation. Bringing the last block into place and preparing the interior for the Ark of the Covenant required liturgical choreography as well as construction skill. The temple's inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was an enclosed cube designed to house the Ark and to mark the spot where the divine presence would dwell. The biblical narrative reaches its climax when the priests carry the Ark into the chamber and a cloud, the glory of the Lord, fills the house so that the priests cannot stand to minister. 1 Kings 8:10-11. The reaction of the people and the king's prayer of dedication, 1 Kings 8:22 through 61, transform an enormous labor project into a theological covenant moment. The dedication was not merely symbolic, it was the social and religious sealing of the investment, massive sacrifices, a public performance of the covenant, and a reaffirmation of the state's role as custodian of the cult. The narrative records thousands of sacrifices, and trumpets sounded until there was no space to contain them. For the people, the building's completion was the culmination of a national narrative, an expression of identity, power, and piety. So why, after all these accomplishments, is the temple considered impossible to replicate today? The answer is not simply we lack cranes, but a composite of 4 conditions that together made Solomon's temple unique. First, the scale and concentration of resources. The temple required thousands upon thousands of skilled hands, extraordinary stocks of lathable timber, vast supplies of stone, and tons of gold. In the ancient Mediterranean economy, those resources were available because of a specific political moment: Solomon's control of trade routes, tribute arrangements, and a diplomatic partnership with Tyre. Modern projects could match or exceed the material input, but the cost and political will would be enormous and would not serve the same social function. Second, the specialized skills and foreign artisans. The Phoenician tradition in shipbuilding, cedar handling, and metalwork was a decisive contribution. Huram, sometimes transliterated Huram-Abi, is singled out in the biblical text as a craftsman of exceptional ability. His presence shows that the project fused local religious imperative with technical knowledge that had deep regional roots. Recreating that exact pool of craftsmen and their intergenerational craft knowledge is not simply a matter of hiring technicians, it demands cultural continuity. Third, the social organization and labor mobilization. Solomon could marshal conscript labor, embed supervisors within the workforce, and mandate long-term projects in a political environment that accepted such demands. Today's labor laws, ethical standards, and economic structures would make the mobilization of forced labor impossible and morally unacceptable. Even voluntary monumental projects face far greater checks and balances in modern governments. Fourth, the religious purpose and prohibitions shaped the methods. The rule against iron tools, the particular sanctity attached to materials, and the liturgical aims shaped decisions about where and how to work. Those constraints both complicated the task and focused innovation towards solutions: quarry-side finishing, partnership with foreign craftsmen, and careful seamanship. Reproducing the temple for religious reasons would require accepting those constraints or intentionally violating them, which would alter the nature of the undertaking. Even when scholars propose mechanisms, ramps, rollers, wedges, seaborne transport, uncertainty remains about specific details. Which exact combination of ramp gradients, rope compositions, and pulley arrangements was used for the largest blocks? Archaeology and comparative studies offer plausible reconstructions, but they are reconstructions, not eyewitness blueprints. The biblical narrative records the outcomes and the sacred meaning. Technical reconstructions fill in how those outcomes could have been achieved using known technologies and extant archaeological parallels. We must also confront the moral complexity of the story. The temple's construction is a testament to human ingenuity, artistry, and devotion. It is also a record of exploitation, risk, and loss. The workforce that created the gleaming interior and precisely jointed stones included people whose labor was compelled and whose lives were endangered. The temple's grandeur cannot be divorced from that reality. The biblical account does not institutionalize cruelty, yet it does not erase the suffering either. For those who built it, the temple was both a divine project and a human imposition. To understand the temple in full, we have to sit with paradox. Holiness emerged from toil and sacrifice. Beauty grew from systems that demanded human subordination to state and cult. The prohibition against iron tools is a perfect emblem of this paradox. It marks the project as sacred and separates it from profane instruments. Yet that very separation forced ways of working that were often more dangerous and taxing for the laborers. If we step back and evaluate the secrets the ancient builders left behind, several practical clues stand out. First, the prefabrication model. Most stones were prepared at the quarry, marked to their final positions, and then moved into place. Second, the logistical choreography. Timber and metal were brought by sea where possible. Ramps and rollers, coordinated teams, and precise leadership moved the heavy pieces across land. Third, the international alliance. Solomon's partnership with the king of Tyre brought both raw materials and the artisanal knowledge necessary to give the temple its luxury finishes. Fourth, craftsmanship and process. Metal workers like Hiram produced the bronze and gold fittings that masked and protected structural elements, while gold leaf techniques added the dazzling surface without requiring enormous quantities of gold mass. Yet the boldest insight may be this: it was not one single secret that made the temple possible, but a whole system. Engineering, diplomacy, economy, religion, and administration operating in synchrony. Remove one pillar, and the structure still stands as a concept, but loses its capacity to be actualized. That is why, even with modern technology, a true replication that mirrors the original social, political, and ritual character is out of reach. You can reconstruct the geometry, you can copy the materials, you can even commission craftsmen to work in archaic style. But you cannot recreate the ancient web of motives, obligations, and meanings that gave the temple its power. And yet the biblical account insists on the point that matters most to its audience. The temple was not merely an architectural feat. It was the place where the divine presence made itself known. The narrative reaches beyond the nuts and bolts to insist that the building served a theological end. When the priests carried the ark into the Holy of Holies, and the cloud, described as the glory of the Lord, filled the house so that no one could minister, the project crossed from human accomplishment into covenantal sign, 1 Kings 8:10-11. Whether one reads that moment as miraculous or as the religiously coded way to describe a communal experience of awe, the text presents it as the culmination of all the labor and organization. For historians and engineers, the record invites careful parsing. For people of faith, it invites reverence and worship. For everyone, it offers lessons about scale, planning, and the ambiguous price of grand projects. The temple stands as a convergence of human ingenuity and sacred ambition, a built environment that tells us about politics, trade, technology, and devotion. Before we close, a quick note on names and tradition. The biblical narrative refers to the king of Tyre who partnered with Solomon, and to the master craftsman who led the metalworking. In English Bible translations, these figures usually appear as Hiram, the king, and Huram or Hiram, the craftsman. These are the figures identified as providing cedar, craftsmen, and technical leadership. See 1 Kings 5, 1 Kings 7. Using those familiar names helps us connect the technical story to the scriptural narrative. Solomon's temple, therefore, remains a singular achievement, an architectural and logistical triumph built under religious constraint and with a cost measured in human labor and life. Its secrets are not magic, but the accumulated wisdom of quarrymen, sailors, woodcutters, foundry masters, and administrators who coordinated their efforts across years. Their legacy is both the structure they created and the ethical questions their methods raise. We can admire the gold in engineering without closing our eyes to the realities behind them. If you want to see what happened to the temple in the end, the destruction that altered its place in history and made the dedication an even more poignant moment, watch our next episode on the fall and later fate of Solomon's temple under Nebuchadnezzar. And if you found this exploration illuminating, subscribe for more deep dives into the tech, politics, and human stories behind ancient monuments.